Hi everyone, it's Dr. Ramani. Welcome back to this YouTube channel on all things related to narcissism. It's my hope that the content on this channel will give you understanding of what these dynamics are, how these personalities work, why they affect you the way they do, and how to stay sane in the midst of this. Now, I'm going to be starting a new series on the different ways people talk about narcissism without saying the word. And this is an issue that comes up where people just don't want to say the word as though it's sort of a bad word. But if you can understand what some sort of these code words are that people use that people use to talk about narcissism, can make this make more sense to you. Because it's always fascinating to me how often journalists, media types, commentators, HR folks, professionals try to say the word narcissist to describe someone without saying it. It becomes important to understand the language that people use. The word is so tricky, and my guess is that for risk management reasons, people who are like editors and other gatekeepers may tell their writers or commentators or whomever to not use it for fear of accusations around things like Goldwater rules and don't use clinical terminology and blah, blah, blah. So people try to find their workaround words. The challenge is that these workarounds often do not give a full enough picture or even portray these behavioral styles that are quite narcissistic as a problem that can really cause a lot of interpersonal harm and friction, but rather these words often sort of paint narcissism as sort of a mystical foible or a stylistic issue or a quirk. Now, in this series, I will break down some of these terms so you can actually treat it as a red flag of sorts and tread very lightly. So, I bet some of you have encountered this. Have you ever had someone around you talking about a narcissistic person and they say, oh, don't say that. Like, I just, what they say instead is they say, no, I think this is just their shadow side or their dark side. So that's how they'll describe the person. They'll say, I think this is, you were seeing their shadow. I think we're just seeing their dark side. I guess the assumption is if there's a dark side or a shadow, that somewhere there must be a light side. Now, the concept of the shadow sort of traditionally has Jungian origins, as in Carl Jung. And without giving you the long and dull lecture that I would typically give my undergraduates on this topic, suffice it to say that in Jung's personality model, the shadow is a part of the personality. It's typically a hidden part of the personality, riddled by guilt. It has very primal, ancient, almost species-specific origins, and that has both really evil parts to it and some normal elements to it. The shadow takes in negative emotions that we don't want to express, and so we squash them, and then we resent that having to squash those. Interestingly, Jung once wrote, no tree, it is said, can grow to heaven unless its roots reach down to hell. I suppose those hell roots are the shadow. Now, in Carl Jung's model, we all have a shadow. And the repression of that shadow and the projection of it onto people and situations is really what the issue is. And in simplest terms, in order to get kind of cool and psychologically comfortable with our shadow, requires us to see ourselves holistically. Jungian analytic models and therapies explore this, and for those of you who really want to do the deep dive into Jungian concepts and the shadow, there are lots of wonderful books out there on this model and really describing the shadow. Now, when you really, really do the deep dive and really read Jung's model, it is worth noting that the shadow can really seem like a dark, sort of shame-filled, projection-oriented personality style that when you really read between the lines, yeah, sure, it feels like it's congruent with narcissism. But here's the thing. Most people out there talking about shadows and dark sides are not Jungian analysts. They may have read a blog someone wrote, or maybe just some quick little something or other, but the tendency is to talk about narcissism as the darkness or the shadow that lurks in all of us. So then the enabling finish on all of that is that, well, if all of us have a shadow, then we need to learn to become more accepting of it. And this is where it becomes a problem. I am not a Jungian analyst. I was not trained in this model well. I just did the reading I've done. And I can see how it may be the case that this shadow idea would be put out there as a way to frame narcissism, not as narcissism, but when lack of empathy, entitlement, grandiosity, arrogance, control, contempt, invalidation, manipulation, and rage are all neatly packaged into the idea of a person living in their shadow self. Well, unless that so-called shadow is lying on an analyst's couch 3 times a week and really doing the psychological work, it actually feels more to me like a very tidy way to not take on the real toxicity, harm, damage, and hurt raised by this personality style and simplify it to be some ephemeral, interesting intellectual idea. The people having to deal with this shadow self in their lives may feel little solace, but also may feel that, well, Jung says we all have shadows, so maybe I have no right to be mad and hurt for the verbal abuse, since that means I have a dark side too. In fact, narcissistic people often try to soften their bad behavior by saying, well, I think we both behaved badly. It's not a zero-sum game. They behaved in an awful, abusive way, and the other person in this interaction might have been a little less than graceful. No, we didn't both behave badly. In essence, what the narcissistic person is trying to do is swallow you up into their shadow. Don't walk into the darkness, walk into the light. Now, calling it a dark side or a shadow self, also in a sort of twisted way, kind of romanticizes all of this too. A sort of brooding, bad, but yet alluring person who has that mysterious dark side. And for every person out there who had the bad boy, bad girl, bad person predilection, wanted that sort of bad person to date, this concept can sometimes take narcissism into a territory that almost fetishizes it and makes it kind of seductive and dangerous instead of something that is actually frankly mentally unhealthy for everyone involved. So when I hear people tell me, the narcissists themselves or people who are close to them, about their dark sides and their shadow selves, I'm sort of struck by the rather slick branding, trying to humanize behavior that is anything but. So keep in mind what this series is about. It's the words people say instead of using the word narcissism. So when you hear someone talking about what they're going through in a relationship, or they're getting treated really badly in a relationship and they're not getting out, and people say, well, I know it's their shadow that's coming out. Well, let me tell you, that shadow is going to make them miserable, and you'll see the longer you stay in that relationship, the more the shadow moves all of its boxes into the house. Just be aware. Thanks again.